Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans, and as many of you know, here on the Lloyd Evans channel, I'm continually trying to learn more about the cult experience and what it does to people mentally and emotionally. One thing I'm fascinated to learn more about is religious trauma syndrome. Who better than to help me understand this is someone who has been a student of religion most of his life and holds a master's degree in religion, as well as a bachelor's degree in sociology, anthropology, with a doctorate in psychology. Dr. Darrel Ray is the founder and president of the board of directors of Recovering from Religion. He has been a psychologist for over 40 years and is the author of 4 books, 2 on organizational teamwork, as well as The God Virus, How Religion Infects Our Lives and Culture, and Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. Dr. Darrel Ray, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm super glad to be on here, Lloyd. Good to talk to you again.
It's an absolute thrill. And again, it's an area in which I'm constantly trying to expand my knowledge, because I don't know how much you know about Jehovah's Witnesses, but we're not the most educated bunch.
I actually know a bit about you. Yeah.
And, psychology, of course, an area in which there is so much complexity, so much nuance. Right off the bat, I'd like to kind of address the whole kind of theme of religious trauma syndrome from a skeptical point of view. Is it a real thing, or is it something that is it a term that atheists have come up with as a means of criticizing religion?
Well, let's begin a little bit deeper than that, or a little lower than that, if you will. And that is, let's just talk about trauma itself and the definition of trauma. And then we can decide whether there's such thing as religious trauma or not. But going to the very basics, the whole notion of trauma has actually not been around that long. We've known trauma for probably a century. It used to be called shell shock from World War I. It was called battle fatigue from World War II. And then later, and only much later, as a result of Vietnam, we were starting to diagnose a pattern of symptoms. Now, this pattern's been known for years. We call it PTSD now, post-traumatic stress syndrome. However, it's not limited to war. It's just not. There's a lot of places you can be traumatized in life. So what I want to do is make sure that we understand that there is such a thing as trauma, and in a PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder or syndrome. If you look at what a syndrome is, it's a cluster of symptoms that are displayed by the person. And so in psychology, we've got something we call the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5. And in Europe, there's a parallel. I just drew a blank on what the name of that is. But it's a parallel to help medical professionals and psychologists diagnose conditions. Because it's just like, you go to your physician, you've got an infection, you want them to diagnose the right bug. Because if you give them the wrong antibiotic, the bug's not going to get killed. And that's the same way with what we do in psychology. We want to diagnose the right condition so we can use the right treatment for that condition. And what we've learned in the last 20 years or so is very sophisticated and very effective methods of treating PTSD. And it's mainly come from war victims, both soldiers and civilians, dealing with the trauma of having a bomb go off, close to your house, or your house being shaken to death by an earthquake. You might know all about that. Yeah. And I would say this: there are people in your town, in your village, where you just fled, who are probably going to be living with the effects of trauma for years, including your own family or some people who you're close to. So this is not theoretical. This isn't because somebody went to Iraq or Afghanistan. It happens routinely. among humans and other animals. We actually have evidence that animals experience trauma going back about 80 years to, or almost 90 years to some of the early work of Pavlov. If you've ever taken a course in psychology, you know who Pavlov was.
Oh yeah, obviously, yeah.
Yeah. So what we've established, hopefully, in this early discussion is there is such a thing as trauma. We can diagnose it. We know what the symptoms look like. And it happens outside of just war, and it can happen to civilians in war, it can happen to soldiers in war, and it can happen to people who experience an earthquake or a tornado. But that can also happen to people in other conditions. And that's when we move into the next level. And that is there such a thing as childhood trauma? Because that's where a huge majority of trauma comes from, is childhood. And with that, I want to introduce you and your audience to something. You can just get online and Google it. Look for adverse childhood experiences. And there's a little test, just a few questions that you can take. And what there's massive amount of research now on how children respond to certain adverse conditions in their environment. And many times a child will get traumatized by something in their environment. An adult has no clue. It doesn't traumatize the adult. But for a child, his brain is just now developing and is susceptible to environmental influences that adults have long since gotten beyond. They're protected in some ways. Children experience trauma, and that trauma can go on into adulthood. So our second step, we're going to kind of go 1, 2, 3 steps up. First step is we've established there's trauma, and it happens at a wide range. The second step is we've established that children experience trauma differently than adults. And a lot of the reason they experience it is because their brains are just developing. Developing brains, we know, are very susceptible to influences that adult brains are not, whether it be in animals or in humans. The evidence is in everywhere in both higher level mammals and primates and humans. So we know that we all experience trauma in childhood, or can. Harry Harlow experienced way back in the 70s, 80s, where he basically took the mothers away from their babies of monkeys and then watched the effects of that. It would be unethical, even illegal, to do that experiment today. But that experiment clearly showed you could traumatize a baby monkey. And it wasn't hard to do. Just separate the mother from the...
Kind of surprised if they weren't traumatized. I mean, I suppose from a scientific point of view, they want to establish that. But, you know, if you were to ask me in advance, will the monkeys be traumatized? I would have said yes. But yeah. It makes sense.
Makes common sense. And then that leads us to another important component, and that is that babies, infants, children have incredibly deep genetic programming to listen and obey their parents. Listen, obey. Now, there's a real good reason for that. If your parent says, don't go over there in the bushes because the hyenas or the lions will eat you, the child that listens to their parents is going to survive, and the one that doesn't is going to be eaten by the lion. There'll be a steak dinner for the lion that night. So we are a product of millions of years of listening to our parents. And we're the ones that listen to our parents, so to speak. The ones that didn't listen to their parents aren't here to talk about it today. So there's a very, very deep programming. Now, if that same parent in the modern age says, don't talk to those people over there because they're Catholics and you'll go to hell if you talk to them, or don't go to college because if you read a wrong book, you're going to get sent to hell, or, you know, something like that, then the child listens just as if the parent said, don't go over there because the lion will eat you. To a baby, to an infant, to a child, those two messages are equal. Their brain cannot distinguish between the two. And so the baby that, or the child that says, obeys the mother by not reading a book, by not going to college, basically is entrapped to their brain for the rest of their life if they stay within that framework, of course. Now, what happens is that early on, there's other things that are happening. For example, the parent believes that spare the rod, spoil the child. then they don't see any problem with beating a child. Now, beating anybody is traumatic. If I took a whip and said, we're going to tie you up and whip the shit out of you today, Lloyd, I'm guessing by the end of that, you would be traumatized. Unless, of course, you're into BDSM, in which case you might not be. But
I'm seeing another side of you here, Daryl Ray, that's for sure.
So beating an adult would be traumatizing. How much more is it traumatizing to a child who is so incredibly dependent upon their adult protectors? And that's why we see I have worked with child protective care services. I've been a child psychologist, family psychologist for a good deal of my adult life. I have never seen a single child say anything but I love my parents, no matter how much the parent abused them, no matter how many cigarette burns the child had on their body, they still love their parents. That's how deeply programmed children are. And a child can be incredibly traumatized by abusive behavior that coming from parents that is religiously motivated. And therein gets us to the third level of what we're going to today, and that is there religious trauma? And I'm suggesting that religious trauma for many people, not everybody, but many people starts in childhood with religious abuse of the child, beating children, isolating children, threatening them with hell. Those kinds of things have an impact on the child's brain that don't even necessarily phase an adult's brain. I mean, you go to a Catholic and say, you read the wrong book, you're probably going to hell. That would have traumatized them 500 years ago. Now it won't even get on the radar screen. But for a Jehovah's Witness kid, it could traumatize them. This fear of hell, as you know, is just incredibly powerful.
Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in hell, but what they do believe in, of course, is the imminent destruction of everyone who doesn't toe the line or everyone who doesn't be a Jehovah's Witness. And that kind of replaces the fear of hell in many ways. In some ways, kind of in a more imminent way, because whereas hell is something that's waiting for you in the afterlife, Armageddon could strike at any moment. So you're constantly on tenterhooks,
Well, let me reframe that, because all the patriarchal religions have some kind of hell in them. But for what you described, it's really not hell that is probably causing a lot of the consternation. It's fear of abandonment, fear of isolation. And it goes back again to our deep programming as human beings. If you're in the savannas of Africa as a hunter-gatherer tribe, and the tribe decides we don't want you in our tribe anymore, and they kick you out, you're not going to be able to go to another tribe, and you're not going to be able to survive on your own. You are going to be dead within days, if not weeks. And that's just a fact of life. People can't survive in those environments without their group. So fear of abandonment, fear of being rejected has an existential component to it that's buried inside of our very species. We wouldn't be here today talking if we didn't have that in us. What religion does is it comes along and says, oh, we can take advantage of that. We can give you some bad ideas around what it means to belong to our tribe. And if you violate those ideas, you get isolated. Well, the fear of being isolated in Africa is the same emotional response of the fear of being isolated in the Jehovah's Witness in Australia, for example. It's the same emotion. Now, obviously, the person who gets isolated isn't going to die in Australia, in Sydney, Australia today, but they will feel like it. And recovering from religion, we get people chatting into us all the time and calling in, and their body is responding as if this is an existential threat to them, that they will die, that their emotions are out of control. Their brain can't stop thinking about the isolation, the condemnation, the rejection, all these things. And remember, that same child still lives in us if we're 30 years old. And I see so many 30-year-olds who just cannot get over the fact that their parents won't talk to them anymore. They haven't talked to them in 10 years, and they're still, I just wish I could talk to my parents again, knowing full well the chances of that happening are almost zero. And yet they can't get over it. That's how deeply programmed some of this stuff is.
I've spoken to experts on ostracism who verify what you're saying. And of course, there's Dr. Kip Williams, who has done a lot of work in this area. And he develops, I think, some kind of computer system or computer model for throwing a ball between a person and a computer and another person or computer, and actually measuring the response when suddenly the ball stopped being thrown to them. And that's like a tangible, measurable response, even when we're not talking about a family person. We're just talking about somewhat a computer or person not throwing a ball to you anymore. So you can only imagine, like you say, it is an existential issue, isn't it? Yes. And I think I've spoken to an expert on ostracism who said that actually it's a tangible pain. It is, because, as you say, there's an existential component to it. You know, as you say, if we're on the savannah, you need to either, and you're being rejected by your tribe, you need to find another tribe or you're going to die. Most likely you're not going to be able to find another tribe, so you need to patch things up, you know. And
you will do about anything to patch those things up. And we see this in people, and I'm going to use the term, this is not to denigrate anybody going through this, but I've seen people waste decades of their life pining over the loss of their parents. That's how strong this is. And they're wasting in the sense that other people who had not been brainwashed, had not been traumatized by Jehovah's Witness or Mormons or any other major high control cult would have been doing something productive with those 10 years or those 20 years. Much more productive. They would have gone to college. They would have gotten a degree. They would have gotten a better job. They would have gotten promotions. They would have trained their children in ways that their children would become more productive and enjoy life. And of course, then there's the whole sexual component. How many people's entire sexuality is disrupted because of this? And I'm not just talking trans children or gay children. I'm talking about people who've been put through things like the purity culture in some religions where, you know, even think about having sex, to even masturbate to porn or anything like that is going to condemn you in some way, shape, or form. So I talk about the sexual repression component quite a bit in my own book, because in the Jehovah's Witness religion, you're only allowed to marry other Jehovah's Witnesses. So immediately your pool of potential partners is constrained. You're only allowed to have sex after you're married. You're not allowed to masturbate. So there's all sorts of constraints being placed on you, which I argue in my book can have a traumatizing effect, or they can have a far-ranging effect. Right. That isn't necessarily quantifiable, even in terms of the way people respond emotionally and behaviorally. I'm a gardener, and I basically live in a forest on my property. And there's a couple trees that, when I first moved here, were upright saplings of not more than probably 7 or 8 years old. And a much bigger tree fell on these two saplings. And so the sapling went down like that. It was bent over almost to the ground. Not quite, but almost. And in the subsequent years, that big tree, of course, it rotted away. But the sapling has been pushed down, and the sapling then did this. I will use my hand this way. The sapling is down, but now it starts growing back up towards the sunlight. So now you have almost a sapling that goes up, over, and up. A very, very unnatural way for that tree to grow, but it's the only way that tree is going to grow because of that early damage in its, quote, childhood. Well, now we've got a tree that is constitutionally compromised. It will not be able to withstand windstorms or heavy ice storms or snowstorms. It has been damaged. And therein lies a metaphor, I think, for what is happening to children in high control environments with respect, for example, their sexuality. If you're constantly beating up a child mentally or even physically for just developing as a normal sexual human being, I mean, I could never be a Jehovah's Witness because I've masturbated my whole life and I'm not afraid to talk about it or admit it. But if I was beaten up by my parents when they caught me,
more of that's on a future video.
I was 12 years old and my mom came in my bedroom unannounced and caught me masturbating.
Well, maybe on this video.
Well, I use that as an illustration because my mother was religious and we were pretty fundamentalist, but not Jehovah's Witness and not Mormon. We were just a generic conservative Christian. And she sat down at the side of my bed and patted me on the shoulder and says, "That's okay, Daryl. It's okay. You won't do it when you're married." Now, she was right, half right there. It's okay, but I did do it when I was married. But what if my mother had come in and caught me and called my dad in and berated me in public and then turned my butt over and spanked my butt and said, "If you ever get caught doing that again, we're going to throw you out of the house"? How would I be talking to you today? And if I was, how would I be talking? That at 12 years old with a very sensitive brain that is hyper focused on sex and development, I would have been traumatized. Thankfully, I wasn't, but I would have been.
And then there's the situation of those who are gay and kind of are able to realize that fairly early on, but at the same time are being told in fundamentalist groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, oh, this is a lifestyle choice. And those who make this lifestyle choice deserve destruction if they don't quit it. So,
right.
What this is going to do to people's minds, just unthinkable.
Well, now let's go to the fourth level, and that is the actual diagnosis of trauma and some of the issues around that. Let me begin by saying we have a clear set of symptoms that we can define in the DSM-5 that help us diagnose post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder. We know what those symptoms look like. At the present time, we don't have a diagnostic criteria in the DSM for religious trauma syndrome. And, I don't really care whether we've got a diagnostic category. We already have the criteria. So whether you call it PTSD from war, from early childhood generic abuse, early childhood abuse by religion, or later trauma by religion for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. In some ways, it doesn't matter if we have a, quote, official diagnosis in the DSM or any other official thing for what we are calling religious trauma syndrome. Because again, a syndrome is a cluster of symptoms. If we can put a cluster of symptoms together that all are consistent with trauma, then we ask what caused that trauma. Was it a bomb, IED going off? Was it an earthquake? Was it being beaten at 5 years old for being caught masturbating? Any of those could be just equally traumatic. We don't need, and I'm trying to be clear about this, we don't need a specific diagnosis. We already know people are traumatized by religion. That's actually, now that we've gone through our 4 different levels, it's pretty obvious. Religion is a component that can cause trauma. Not everybody, and I mean, I was raised religious. I have no evidence that I was traumatized. I learned some bad ideas. I was influenced by some bad ideas, but I wasn't traumatized. Other groups like Jehovah's Witnesses are traumatizing their children through the behavior that's motivated by the religious dogma itself. And those people grow up, have children, and re-traumatize their children. And that's why we're talking here today. I think we want to try to break that cycle of people. And people who have left a religion oftentimes continue to believe some of the bullshit that their religion gave them. And child rearing is just one of those pieces of bullshit.
Well, obviously, when it comes to my understanding and my views on religion, you're kind of preaching to the choir. But what interests me is, and you alluded to this slightly a moment ago, is to what extent are your peers on board? Because if religious trauma syndrome isn't an official diagnosis, do you see us getting to a point where it can be at some point and where people can just go to their doctor, explain their experience and get the needed attention?
Well, theoretically, you should be able to go to any well-trained, and that's important, well-trained mental health professional, tell them your symptoms, and they will say, you've got trauma. Now, the problem is that if you go to some mental health professionals who are still there themselves religious, they may not have ever heard the term religious trauma syndrome, or they have the misunderstanding in their head that religion doesn't cause trauma. I wasn't traumatized by my religion, so it must not be a bad thing. That's, of course, a false assumption. It's just like people can go through horrible experiences in a war and not be traumatized by them, where the person next door is incapacitated with their trauma. People respond differently. And we know that different personality types are more susceptible or less susceptible to certain traumatizing experiences. It's just like, if the flu comes through my area this winter, I might get the flu, my neighbor might not, my spouse might not get the flu, but I got it because my immune system is different from theirs. It's kind of the same way. Some personalities are more resistant to bad ideas or certain bad ideas than others. So what I'm saying is...
But when we're talking about science, there shouldn't be that sort of subjectivity. And this is one of my frustrations. I mean, I talk about mind control quite a bit on my channel, and you've used the word brainwashing. There are some who recoil at the very notion that brains can be washed, that minds can be controlled by external forces. And when you go on, I think, the Wikipedia page for mind control, there's some degree of skepticism as to whether it's even a thing. When are we going to put two and two together? And when is the scientific community going to say, number one, people can be controlled by other people or by groups, and number two, religious trauma syndrome is a thing and should be diagnosed as quickly as possible? When can we expect that to happen?
Well, we actually had a conference scheduled last March, Religious Trauma Syndromes conference in Vancouver, Canada, which got canceled. We've used that opportunity to talk to a lot of people like yourself about that, and hopefully we're getting the word out. I think it's just in the last couple of years, Dr. Marlene Winnell coined the term religious trauma syndrome, and we owe her a debt of gratitude for really identifying the core symptoms. But she coined it 10 years ago. And I will tell you, 8 years ago, nobody had heard about it. This year, almost all of the mental health professionals of any persuasion can at least tell you the term and what it generally means. And they may or may not deny it's there, but the fact is it's out there. And because we're talking today, and we've been talking to a lot of people about this, the word is getting out. And if you go to your mental health professional and you say, I think I'm experiencing religious trauma, and they deny it to you, I would say, get the hell out of there. Get out of there as quickly as possible. Go and find a therapist who's well-trained, because simply telling the symptoms should be enough. And then you say, and I got these symptoms as a result of this religious experience, that's a clue that any mental health professional should pick up on. Now, I want to go to, in our fourth level, I've gone to 3 levels in the fourth level, and that is, and this is almost goes clear back to our basic piece. Trauma is a change in the brain. It's that simple. And you ask about science. We can do MRIs on people. We can look at behaviors. We can look at cortisol levels, we can look at adrenaline levels. There are lots of indicators of stress that can easily be found with the right testing. There are MRIs that can easily show that the amygdala is energized, that the hypothalamus is doing things it doesn't normally do within people who are under high stress or who have been traumatized. Let me give you an example that most people would identify with. If you are faced with a life-threatening experience, let's just be primitive about it. A lion is about to eat you. Your adrenal gland is going to put out all sorts of stress hormones that will help you survive in that, or try to help you survive in that situation. If every day you face a lion, and I don't mean just once, I mean every single day you face a lion, you may survive every day, but you still got a lion trying to eat you, your adrenal gland is going to get very used to having to put out that higher level of drug. And it's a drug. It's pumping adrenaline into your entire system, and it's keeping you on hyper alert state. It's going to affect your amygdala, where fear is processed. It's going to affect your hypothalamus, where learning, hippocampus, sorry about that. It's going to affect your hippocampus, where learning takes place. And before long, just a pet lion, a model of a lion or a photograph of a lion might motivate your entire body to respond in inappropriate ways. That is the scientific evidence that we have trauma when the person is continually responding inappropriately to their environment. Somebody who is hypersensitive about spiders, show them just a photograph of a spider and they'll say, oh, that doesn't bother me. But do an MRI on them, or watch what's happening to the cortisol and adrenal levels in them, and they don't even know it, but they're responding in a stress response. That's what we see in people who are experiencing PTSD. They're on hyper alert, they're hyper vigilant, they're responding to their environment inappropriately or too strongly. It's the firecracker goes off and the guy hits the floor. Because in wartime, that's a survival thing, but in this time, it's the 4th of July, at least in the United States. So, Lloyd, there is scientific evidence, and it's quite deep. These are not new things, and we're getting better and better at identifying some of this stuff. When you go to your mental health counselor, they're not going to put you in an MRI machine. They're not going to take blood levels. I mean, that's absurd. That you don't need that level of testing. All you need is, I can't sleep at night because I keep thinking of, what's going to happen to me if I leave God. My family doesn't respond to me anymore. I miss my parents deeply, and that's disturbing me. I can't have sex with my wife or my husband because I was taught sex is impure. Even though I'm married and I know I can now, I still have this in the back of my mind. I mean, I masturbate now and I feel guilty for a month after having masturbated. And then I do it again. And I feel even more guilty. So all these things, you could start putting them together in a cluster that clearly show trauma.
Trying to anticipate objections from those in my audience who are religious, and they are there. I know it because I've polled my audience in the past. One question I'd be fascinated to ask is it possible to spend a significant period of time in a religion, particularly a fundamentalist religious group, and not be traumatized?
Well, of course, I don't have the scientific evidence that would say 100%. I guess the obvious answer is somebody could probably survive it. I wouldn't want to have to go through that experience myself. You've been through the experience.
I ask that, partly because and you used the war analogy.
Yeah.
And, for anyone who's watched any decent war film, they kind of deal with it. The fact that soldiers are intensely traumatized. They called it shell shock, didn't they, in World War I? And we've learned more about it since then. Yeah. And yet you have soldiers who are seemingly able to go into those situations, tour after tour, battle after battle, war after war. And it's almost like they crave it.
Okay, therein lies the hint. If they crave it, that's a personality characteristic. And we all know people who are just highly adventurous. And if they're not out climbing a mountain or walking a tightrope or jumping out of a perfectly good airplane with a parachute, they don't feel satisfied. That person in a war, maybe who craves being on the front line or craves doing whatever they're doing in the army, that's a personality type. It has nothing to do with religion, of course. But we can look at other personality types. And there are some personality types that probably will be less likely to be traumatized. There's 5 human personality components. I won't go into all of them, but the one that is most correlated with religiosity is something called openness to new experience and curiosity. Now, it is negatively correlated. So if I could give a person a test and find out that they score really low on openness to new experience and curiosity, that would be one of the better predictors that they are susceptible to high religiosity. Because religion gives you all the answers. It's black and white, right, wrong, good, bad. If you've got all the answers, that's all you need. That period. And about 20 to 25% of the population have that personality component. So they're going to be very comfortable inside of a high control organization, or much more comfortable in high control, because it's like a nice warm coat around you on a cold day. They just feel, oh, it's so snug inside Jehovah's Witnesses. We have all the answers. We've got our own little built-in tribe here. I don't have to worry about, anybody attacking us. So they put a nice coat on. Go to the other side of that personality component, the one that likes to be jumping out of airplanes or climbing mountains, and it feels like a straitjacket to them. The exact same environment could feel like a straitjacket to one and a comfy coat with another one. That's how personalities interact with their environment. And when you add high control cults to it, it can have dramatic impacts. Think about the guy or the woman who's, feels like this is a straitjacket, and they want to open the straitjacket up and throw it off. How's the rest of the tribe, the Jehovah's Witnesses tribe, going to treat that person? And all they're doing is following their own personality lead. That's their personality. Somebody who's got a lot of sexual energy and they express that sexual energy, or somebody who's clearly gay and not afraid of it, they're not going to get back in the meeting house after they come out. So, and they'll lose their social support network, and among other things.
Do you think there's something inalienable about religion, or particularly about the mind control component of religion, that delays trauma? Because obviously I've been in a religious group for a number of years, and when you're in the group, you're not feeling traumatized.
No,
this is, everything is perfectly normal. You're scared at the prospect of losing your life at Armageddon, but at the same time, you're not bothered about that, because you know you're going to survive Armageddon because you're a Jehovah's Witness. So, right, yeah. Is there something inherent in the mind control itself that is delaying the symptoms of the trauma?
Well, let's just assume right off the bat that you were not traumatized, that you're fine within this cocoon we call Jehovah's Witnesses in this particular case. But one day you figure it out and you decide to leave. I'm going to suggest, and I'm just giving you the best case scenario here. You were not traumatized as Jehovah's Witnesses. But when you figure out it is a cult, or it is a mind controlling group, or it's much too restrictive for you, and you leave, it's crossing that line from the secure environment to the open world where trauma occurs. And that therein lies the impact of adult trauma. When I leave my comfy culture, and we see this in so many religions, it's just not just for Jehovah's Witnesses. When I leave this comfy culture that has all the right answers, and I suddenly realize my homeschooling didn't teach me shit when it comes to the real world. And think about it in more obvious terms. The Amish have a tradition called Rumspringa. Are you familiar with Rumspringa?
No. Okay.
The Amish have had this for centuries. When a child reaches about 16 years of age, they basically tell, and remember, Amish do not believe in education past 8th grade. So basically anybody in the Amish community, their highest level of education is 8th grade, unless they went, educated themselves beyond that. So at about 16 years of age, they tell all the children, it is time for you to leave. And they literally kick the children out of the community. You go out to the rest of the world and you see how bad that rest of the world really is. And if you come back, fine. If you don't, fine. We don't care. Either way. That's what they call Rumspringa. Look it up. It's really interesting. Well, think about this. You don't know how to run a computer. You don't even know what a smartphone is. You don't even have electricity in your house. You've never been in a car in your entire life. You've been in a buggy with horses in it. That's the world you live in every day. And suddenly you're thrown out here into the real world. One of two things is going to happen. You're going to be traumatized just trying to adjust to this new world, or you're going to come back home where the safety is and stay the rest of your life. I'm giving you this example.
It's a rigged test, isn't it?
Absolutely rigged. Absolutely.
It's similar to a similar thing happens with Jehovah's Witnesses, because they have a rule whereby parents don't have to shun their child so long as their child isn't an adult, is a minor, and is living under their roof. However, if the child is an adult, let's say they're 18, and they are technically able to look after themselves, they're going to be shown the door. But the trouble is, an 18-year-old Jehovah's Witness isn't the same as an 18-year-old non-Jehovah's Witness, because an 18-year-old Jehovah's Witness thinks that the entire world is doomed and depraved and looking to exploit them in some way.
Yep, exactly.
So it's a rigged situation. Yeah.
So we can see by the extreme example of the Amish that Jehovah's Witnesses have almost a similar situation. And the Amish, once you leave, if you don't come back, you will never see or hear your family again. You're gone. You're dead to them. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, through disfellowship, have a similar thing. I mean, I've known many Jehovah's Witnesses who haven't spoken to their family at all in 20 or 30 years. They don't even know if they're alive. They find out that they've had a brother or a cousin or uncle died. Nobody bothered to let them know. So it's that crossing from inside the cocoon to outside that has the potential for real trauma within a certain portion of the population, for sure. So whether you were, back to your original question, Lloyd, whether you were traumatized while you're in Jehovah's Witnesses or not, the potential for trauma happens when you step outside. Again, maybe you're the kind that can survive it without a lot of consequences. But let's go back and ask in all likelihood, you did experience some trauma, just like the tree I told you about earlier. It was kind of traumatized by a bigger tree falling on it, and then it had to grow odd direction. I'm going to guess, Lloyd, that you and many people within your church had that kind of trauma. You just didn't know it because that's the way everybody else behaved. Everybody else had a tree fall on them, so to speak. And nobody thinks that's unusual. You know, it's not unusual to condemn everybody for being a normal sexual human being. Until
you remove the fallen tree and there's a gale force wind, and then we start to find out things are messed up.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. When you step outside, that's when the gale force wind's going to hit you.
So in a way, the mind control is like a suspended state that's stopping people from experiencing the full weight of the trauma, because as far as they're concerned, everything's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's step to the fifth level. I've gone through 4 levels so far. The fifth level is the actual treatment, because I don't want to leave people with the feeling that it's all hopeless.
I'd rather do that, to be honest. I'm kind of a sadist. So if we could leave my audience thinking that the whole thing is hopeless and there's no solution. No, seriously. We've painted quite a bleak picture and we do need a way out of this. So
You're right. So the beauty of psychology, the beauty of science, the beauty of neurological sciences, and our now ability to look inside of people's brains and see what's going on with their amygdala and hippocampus and things like that, is that we not only can devise treatments, but we can actually see if those treatments are working. And it's somewhat a product of the interminable wars that the United States seems to have to always get into, and whether it be Afghanistan or Iraq, soldiers were coming back and they were incredibly damaged. So there was money by the US government put into how do we treat these people? We don't want to treat our returning veterans like we treated our Vietnam veterans or our World War II veterans. So there's been a lot of money go into it. And actually a good friend of mine, Dr. Hector Garcia, is probably the preeminent authority on this. If you want to really talk to somebody who knows what the fuck he's talking about, It's Dr. Garcia. He wrote a great book. I tell him it's the second best book ever written. Obviously, the best one was
Bible being the first. Yeah.
No, it was these two books. I got to pump my own two books.
Of course, by all means.
The God Virus or Sex and God. He wrote a book called Alpha God, which really explains a hell of a lot of the primate behavior we see in religions. All religions engage in primate behavior. So once you understand what primates do and how they behave, you'll start realizing, oh, ministers behave like that, elders behave like that. Lots of people. There's a lot of primate behavior in our culture. So we've devised methodologies for diagnosing trauma, and we've developed about half a dozen effective treatments for the trauma. So once we understand what kind of trauma you've experienced, it could be, there's several different kinds of trauma, by the way, that may or may not be related to religion. But once we've identified those, then we can put together a protocol for literally treating your trauma. And it sounds a little bit unbelievable in some ways, but the treatments have gotten so good in the last 10 years, even in the last 5 years. I mean, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, we're just now coming to grips with how to deal with the trauma that those soldiers came, and the money, the experiments, the therapeutic developments, those are fairly recent. I mean, it took a while to develop these. So what I'm saying is there are some really interesting ways to deal with trauma that we didn't have even 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago. And I don't have time to go into it. I'm not even an expert in that area. That's not my.
But the point is that there are ways that we can help people who have trauma.
And it doesn't take 10 years. The beauty of some of these treatments is literally, and I'm not making any promises to you, I'm not saying this, but there are some treatment modalities that can actually show significant, and I mean, when I say significant, I mean 50 to 70% improvement in symptoms that last for more than 6 months. I mean, that's kind of the gold standard for
Okay, we'll hold you to that, 6 months. Okay.
So, and it may only take a minimum 5 sessions, and maybe 10 sessions. In that few sessions, you can deal with something that's been debilitating for decades. We have seen this, and that's how incredibly revolutionary some of these treatments are. Of course, you have to find a mental health professional that's well-trained and is willing to work with you and has the skills required to do that particular treatment. But we're seeing more and more professionals get trained in these things. And so that means our treatment has actually improved dramatically. It's almost as dramatic as we used to use sulfa drugs to treat bacterial infections, and now we used antibiotics. Well, we know the dramatic improvements in recovery of infections once penicillin was introduced. Not that sulfa drugs weren't viable, but they weren't nearly as viable as penicillin was, and subsequent antibiotics, of course. So it's orders of magnitude better than what we had 10 years ago. You might take years of therapy to get over certain kinds of trauma. We know that you don't have to have that. Now, I'm not saying everybody's going to respond the same way. We know no matter what the treatment is, there's always going to be a certain small percentage, maybe anywhere from 10 to 20%, that don't respond. And it may be because that particular treatment wasn't the right one. We misdiagnosed it. More trauma came along, or they have complex PTSD, and that needs to be treated differently. There's a lot of reasons why somebody might not respond. But when you get 70, 80% response rate, and the symptoms dissipate at a significant degree for 6 months, hell, I mean, if I'm in pain, if I've got back pain that keeps me in bed, and I can find a way to alleviate that for the next 6 months, I'd probably do a whole lot to get rid of that. And that's kind of where we're at here with trauma. People need to recognize their trauma and go get treated for it. And don't think it's going to take you 10 years to get over it. It may be as little as 10 sessions.
It may be that there are people watching this who are themselves mental health professionals or doctors who've previously been skeptical about religious trauma syndrome, if there are any watching like that, what would be your advice to them in terms of how they can expand their knowledge in this area?
Well, two things. I would, first of all, just go look at Dr. Marlene Winnell's own website and look at her. She's done quite a bit of work on this, and Journey Free, it's journeyfree.org, I think it is. Anyway, Journey Free, you'll get it if you Google it. So I would go there and look at it, see what she's writing about. For your listeners or readers, listeners, I would encourage them to read her book on Leaving the Fold, which I think is an excellent book, and many people have said it helped them. That's first. The second is just go get educated on what trauma is and get informed about the treatment modalities that we have out there. There are protocols within what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. There are protocols within dialectical behavioral therapy. There are protocols within mindfulness. There's written trauma therapies. I mean, that's just to name 4 therapies off the top of my head that now have well-documented, scientifically validated protocols. Now, when I say scientific, I mean it tries to meet the gold standard in medicine, and that's double-blind and comparison, maybe even placebo comparisons. All these things the research has really blossomed in these areas. So we're not walking down a blind alley anywhere. We're not taking the word of some psychologist or psychiatrist that it works. We've got peer-reviewed articles that show what the results are. And these go back to the earlier, unfortunately, there is no research, I want to be clear about this, no research that specifically looks at religious trauma. But we've got enough research around trauma specifically that if you look at the symptoms of somebody who we would diagnose as having religious trauma, we can now test. Let's give them this protocol. Let's see if it relieves the anxiety, relieves the trauma, relieves the anxiousness or hypervigilance over a 6-month time period. Now, the reason I use 6 months is because it's hard to follow people for years. But if we can get them to improve their symptoms for 6 months, there's a high probability they're going to continue to remain improved. And the skills we taught them to get where they are in that 6 months are probably going to continue as well. They may need to come back for a refresher occasionally, but that's different than sticking in therapy for 10 years. It's a lot different.
And less expensive, one would imagine.
Yeah, right. And people say this, the issue of expense, Lloyd, I think that's an important component. People tell me all the time, I can't afford to go to therapy. And yet I've suffered for 10 years. I've lost jobs. I've lost family. I've gone through a divorce. So I oftentimes tell people, well, just sit down and go through the calculations. How much money has it cost you to go through a divorce, to lose a child? And yeah, you can't equate money and emotions, but if you've been under incredible stress because you've lost contact with your parents and you can't get over that, could you put a dollar value to that? And if you could, what's it worth to you to get rid of these symptoms, to be able to think more clearly, to perform better at your job, to enjoy your grandkids or your kids? What's it worth to you? If you can't afford it, what you're telling me is you prefer to suffer. It's kind of like, if I give you a pill and get rid of your back pain that has no side effects, would you do it? Most people would, but they don't define emotional pain in the same way as they define physical pain. And I think therein lies something people need to consider.
Obviously, different countries have different approaches when it comes to the funding of healthcare.
Right. Yeah.
I'm just thinking that it would be a massive leap forward if it wasn't down to the individual necessarily, and if the state could step in, recognize that mental health is a key component of one's overall health.
Yes.
And solve the funding issue for individuals who are in this situation.
Right.
Would you like to see that?
Absolutely. I don't know any country on the planet right now that really treats mental health the way I think it should be. And here's a simple thing. It actually, let's be honest, capitalism is going to rule the world or in the near future. I don't see that going away. But even from a capitalist standpoint, helping people perform better, produce better, be happier, that's worth a hell of a lot of money to a capitalist system. And so if we could find a way to help people deal with their trauma, they're going to go to work. They're going to spend their money more wisely. They're going to invest their money more wisely. I mean, a Jehovah's Witness who has been traumatized and walked out of religion with no money skills, and whatever they're doing is not productive, can't keep a job, or in a job that's far lower than what their intelligence level could have done if they were given education. All these things cost a culture, cost a society money. So if you want to just be selfish about it, give people the health care they need, give people the mental health care they need, and they'll be more productive. It's an argument, I think, that could be made, and I haven't seen many people doing it very well. I want to make sure and end on something. I don't know what our time frame is here.
Well, I was going to ask the final question, but by all means, add a supplementary ending. Okay.
Well, it's not a supplementary. It's not an ending. It's an encouragement for people to start getting help. And you can get help in several places. I mean, number one is go to recoveringfromreligion.org and hit the chat button and talk to one of our agents. We don't give therapy. That's not but we do give peer support. And if you want, you can even ask the chat agent, I would like to join your community. And I know there's many communities out there that are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, but even within Recover from Religion, we have an entire community of people talking to each other about the very thing you and I have just talked about. And if you need therapy within Recover from Religion, we have an entire organization called the Secular Therapy Project. And we have 469 registered therapists, many of whom will do talks through Zoom or Skype or whatever, just like this. You can get therapy just like you and I are doing right now, Lloyd. And you don't have to wait to get in an office because COVID has forced people to be online. And that's available. Now, it's not free. Our therapists have to charge. They make a living for it. But our service of helping you find a therapy is totally free. We don't charge for any service we offer inside of Recovery from Religion. Our therapists are not inside. They're therapists who run a practice. But get help. Don't suffer. And don't let your loved ones suffer if you can help them find good therapy or find a peer support. We have support groups that meet online, and they're going to start meeting in person when COVID is finished. So there's always people out here willing to help you and listen to you, help you process your emotions, share the experiences that you've had. You'll find out that there's a hell of a lot of Mormons out there that experience the same thing that you as Jehovah's Witnesses experience. And there's Catholics going through the same shit. It's amazing. It really almost doesn't matter what religion. Every religion seems to have its high control components, and they look a lot like what you've gone through as Jehovah's Witness.
Well, my final question was going to be, what advice do you have for people who are suffering from religious trauma? But since you've answered that, I'll go to a different question. When can we do the masturbation video? I think that's something my viewers are...
Name the date, I can do it. If you have ever seen one of my talks, I always start my talks on human sexuality with, I masturbate, how many of you do? I ask 400 people, whoever's in my speeches, and it's important, I think. I do want to talk about it. If you want to talk about it, we'll come back and we'll talk about human sexuality. And
well, after many unsuccessful attempts to break the internet, I think this may be the one. So let's schedule that. But okay. Dr. Darrel Ray, this has been an absolute delight. I have learned a lot about religious trauma syndrome and look forward to learning more in the future, hopefully by having you back on the channel whenever it suits. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. But for now, thank you so much for watching.